All right, we'll talk UK election in a second. If we can get the tin can to work, we'll get Mark Latham up in a moment or two's time. But let's get back to what we've talked about as a bit of a theme this week, which is sort of the climate McCarthyism. Are you or have you ever been a climate denier? Has been the endless yellings of the press pack, and the Prime Minister answered quite correctly, quite reasonably, quite normally. And this is Goldilocks politics, right? He's too hot, it's too cold. Well, this is what happened. This is what you say when you're right in the middle.
We will continue to work to reduce our emissions, as we should. But what we cannot say, what no one can say, is those programs of themselves are in any way directly linked to any fire event. I know, because I'm a Sydney-sider, and I know how unusual it is to see that haze across my city. And I know how distressing that has been, particularly for young people who wouldn't have seen that before. And so that is why I think it is important to have a sense of calm about these matters.
All right, do we have the connection? Yes, we do. The great Mark Latham. Welcome home, brother. We thought we were done for the year, but you're giving us one last taste of that wonderful, wonderful wit.
Yeah, good on you.
How are you, great man?
Good on you, Paul. Merry Christmas. I'm well, thanks. Merry Christmas to you and all the viewers.
You're a good man. All right, what do you think about this climate McCarthyism where the gallery, the press gallery, the media have just been yelling at every single politician, unless you kiss the climate change ring, you're not allowed to pass go and collect $200?
Well, Paul, as you know, I'm not a big fan of irrational hysteria in politics. You've got to stick to the facts. And the fact is, in Australia, we've been having bushfires for 60,000 years. There's been a feature of Indigenous culture where they were started by lightning strikes, or the Aborigines started the fires themselves to flush the animals out to eat them. And Captain Cook, in the journals there, sailing the Endeavour up the east coast of Australia in 1770, they reported large plumes of smoke up and down the coastal region. So bushfires aren't new, and in terms of smoke haze, it's not new here in southwest Sydney. I don't think ScoMo there in the Shire or the eastern suburbs got this earlier in the year, but when they were doing the backburning and the wind blew in, there were days here in southwest Sydney where there were health alerts where old people couldn't leave their home and kids couldn't play in the school playground. So, you know, these are essentially weather events, man-made and natural weather events, backburning or lightning strikes sparking up bushfires, and it's been a dry period. So, you know, to be talking about a 100-year climate trend in that context is just pure political opportunism and is not supported by the facts. And you can say, oh, scientists predicted this, but yeah, they predicted rising sea levels. We haven't seen that. Tim Flannery said the dams would never fill in Sydney again. They overflowed a couple of times. So, you know, let's stick to the facts, weather events, and support the firefighters who are doing the most important work.
Well, let's go through some numbers here. Now, sadly, 6 people have lost their lives in these fires so far, but let's go back to 2009, where 173 people lost their lives in the fires that were there in Melbourne. There have been fatalities in the years 2005, 3, 2, 97, 65, 63, 74... There were 32 people who died in the 1962 bushfires in Victoria. There were 60 people who died in the 1926 bushfires in Victoria, and there's plenty more that go on. So help me out here, Nicholas. How is 2019 worse than when more people died in the past? And how the hell is Scott Morrison to blame when Kevin Rudd wasn't to blame when more people died when he was the Prime Minister?
Well, look, I think using the loss of human life as the measure of severity of bushfires is not really giving people a complete picture, Paul, because as I think you anticipated earlier, our emergency services are getting much better at what they do. Emergency alert systems are getting much better. People have got mobile phones. They can be warned about impending danger, and so they can escape danger, and therefore, thankfully, less people are losing their lives in these fires. But that doesn't mean the fires aren't getting worse. In fact, they are getting worse, and the data is there to prove that. And the reason why they're getting worse, Paul, is because of climate change. It's because southeast Australia is getting drier. In fact, at the moment, 99% of New South Wales is in drought. And when you have circumstances where it's as dry as that, tinderbox dry, and then you get lightning strikes, the fires start. So here we are, mid-December. We haven't even got to the worst part of the fire season yet, but we've already lost 2.5 million hectares to fire, and Sydney is shrouded in smoke. And Mark's right, you know, yes, southwest Sydney, they have experienced smoke before, but I don't know the people of Sydney have seen smoke like this day after day in December ever before. And I've got to just fact-check Mark a little bit here because, you know, he sort of talked about
good luck taking him on.
And so on. All right, well, I'm very pleased to do, and I've got a lot of respect for Mark, but I do need to pick him up where he's just got his facts wrong. I mean, he went after Tim Flannery saying,
Nicholas.
Tim Flannery said the dam levels will never rise again. Well, guess what? The dams are at record lows in Sydney at the moment. You're going to have to build a desalination plant.
He said the
because it doesn't
seas
rain
were
enough
going to
anymore.
rise and he bought seaside property.
And he also said,
Overflowed many times.
I'll finish
The
on that point
government
if
is
you like.
lifting the damn wall. They're lifting the damn wall.
I'll just fact-check you on one final point, Mark, and that is you said sea levels won't rise. Well, in fact, they are rising. In fact, the Bureau of Meteorology will tell you here in Port Phillip Bay in Melbourne,
Pinch Cut. They're not
they've lifted
rising
by
at
7
all.
centimetres, and that's why the beaches are getting washed away.
The oldest measure of sea
So let's
levels
deal with the
in Sydney
scientific
Harbour.
facts here,
It's a
guys.
small fraction of a millimetre.
The reality is, in the part of Sydney in which I live, which is northern Sydney.
Where's the fiction library?
Yep.
In the part of Sydney in which I live, in the northern beaches, the 1994 fires were absolutely of the same. I'm not going to use the word catastrophic because it's become a coloured word that is trying to emote something that doesn't belong. They were ferocious fires. It completely wiped out all the vegetation around the Wakehurst Parkway. The whole of West Head went up. And the thing about the bush in Australia, the eucalypts, is they explode. And they explode and the fireballs take off. And they spread the fire with a ferocious speed. Fire is part and parcel of our landscape. It always has been. And the reason that I think the people who want to put fear of God into people about climate change is because the weather affects everyone. We talk about it, but we don't remember how bad or how good or how different it was. We simply really know how it is today.
But also, if we want to talk about, total areas affected equals, see how it's getting worse. In 1974, the Cobar fire, 1.5 million hectares. 1974, also, another fire in New South Wales was 1.1 million. But let's go back to the Black Thursday fire of 1851. 5 million hectares were lost, Nicholas. Last time I checked, not quite the same number as what's happened now.
Look, I don't know what the firefighting services were like back in 1851, Paul, but I suggest to you that they weren't the mighty force we've got at the moment. 2,600 firefighters with some great equipment out there taking it on. But like 2.5 million hectares is absolutely awful. And just to the point about fire being a feature of the Australian bush, I do agree with that. But the fires are more intense now than ever before. So let me, in Victoria,
Nicholas,
for example...
fires are intense because there's fuel on the ground.
I was just going to give you a bit more science, Bronwyn. Just hear me out, please.
All right, finish up because I want to get Mark back in.
OK, very quickly. So in Victoria, after the 2009 fires, it was so intense, the fires in the mountain ash forest, that the mountain ash trees have not grown back like they used to after fires over previous eons. So the ecosystem is fundamentally being changed because of the drying out of the forest and because the fires now burn more intensely than ever before.
All right, Mark, you get the last word on this.
Well, you know, it's true there's been 1 degree of warming since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Some ecosystems are changing pretty steadily, gradually, slowly. But to say that one fire event that started with lightning strikes just west of here in the Blue Mountains is a climate event is a fraud on the people. And Nick talks about fact-checking. You just can't mix up weather and climate events. If you want to talk in any credible way about climate change, you've got to talk over decades and centuries, not one fire because of lightning strikes in one city in 1 month. And this is going to ultimately discredit the climate change cause. People aren't silly. When Flannery said the dams wouldn't overflow and they did, people thought, climate change is a load of BS. The oldest sea measurement mechanism in Australia is in Sydney Harbour, and it's been a small fraction of a millimetre in over 100 years. So again, people don't see sea levels rising. They think climate change is BS. So people like Nick would be better off just sticking to the facts, not confusing weather and climate, not being hysterical, not being irrational, not putting porkies out there, and actually talk to people about the facts, because that's the only way you ever get a public response instead of this dreadful debate that, quite frankly, is quite fictitious.
But also, Bronwyn, what about some of the deliberate blurring of the line between federal and state responsibilities here about who is actually responsible for fighting fires? And these, look, I would love to pay the volunteer firefighters, but there's a couple of 100,000 volunteers around the emergency services. That's more than we have in the actual paid army.
Paul, this is not the first time this discussion has taken place. It takes place every time we have fires that last a long time, and people get exhausted, and people find their financial resources are running out, and they usually find a way of compensating for certain things, and that'll evolve in discussion. But you're quite right, it is a state responsibility, but the Commonwealth has other responsibilities to step in when there's a need, and saying that they will guarantee the money for the leases of the aircraft that are doing the bombing to put out fires, which is so essential because so many of those fires are in national parks, which have been blocked off. The trails that were in place to let firefighters in, they can't, so they need the aircraft to bomb them. So again, it's states which have not been responsible by allowing these block-offs to occur. So we have to have another solution, aircraft.